The room was quiet when the old man leaned a little closer to the microphone and smiled softly. His voice was calm, but there was something powerful hidden inside it. "Everyone wants to know the secret," he said slowly. "I'm 104 years old, and people always ask me the same question. Mr. Daniel, how did you live so long? How are you still smiling like this?" He chuckled lightly, the kind of laugh that only comes from someone who has seen almost everything life can show. "Most people think I'm going to say something simple, like drink olive oil every day, walk 5 miles every morning, or drink a little red wine before sleep." He paused as people in the room laughed. "Sure, I do those things sometimes, but that's not the secret." He leaned forward a little more, almost like he was about to share something people spend their entire lives trying to discover. "You want to know the real secret?" He pointed gently toward the audience. "The secret is that you choose." For a moment the room went silent. "You choose every single day," he continued. "Joy isn't something that randomly happens to you. It's not something life delivers to your door when everything finally becomes perfect. Joy is a decision." He looked around slowly, making eye contact with the people sitting there. Most people never understand this. They keep waiting for life to make them happy. They say things like, "I'll be happy when I get the right job, when I make enough money, when I meet the right person, when everything becomes easier." He shook his head gently, and many people die waiting. He smiled again, not in a sad way, but in a way that felt full of wisdom. "But I didn't wait," he said. "I decided." And that's why, even after more than a century of life, his eyes still had a spark in them. Now let me ask you something for a second. Have you ever caught yourself thinking, "I'll be happy when..." Maybe when your life finally becomes stable, when you finally achieve something big, when the problems disappear. If you've ever felt that way, you're not alone. Almost everyone does. But what this old man learned after an entire lifetime might change the way you see things forever, because his life was not easy, not even close. When he was just 5 years old, he watched his mother slowly fade away from illness. Her name was Rosa. She was only 30 when tuberculosis took her life. He remembered small things about her. The way she used to hum while cooking, the way she would brush his hair with gentle hands. But the memory that stayed with him the most was one painful moment. He remembered her coughing into a small cloth handkerchief, and the color of the cloth slowly turning red. He didn't fully understand what was happening back then. He was only a child. All he knew was that one day she was there, and the next day she wasn't. Imagine losing your mother before you even understand what loss means. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever lost someone important in your life? Someone whose absence changed everything? If you feel comfortable sharing, tell me in the comments who that person was. Sometimes just remembering them keeps their presence alive in a beautiful way. After his mother passed away, life became even harder. When Daniel was 8 years old, his father made a decision that would change everything. With only $40 in his pocket and barely any English, he took his young son and boarded a ship to America in 1928. They arrived in New York with nothing except hope. The neighborhood they moved into was crowded, loud, and full of struggling immigrant families. 7 people slept inside a tiny apartment room. Sometimes Daniel slept on the floor beside the door because there wasn't enough space for a bed. Life wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy, but it was the only life they had. By the time he turned 10 years old, Daniel was already working beside his father in a small shoe repair shop. Every day after school, he would sit at a wooden bench, learning how to stitch leather and repair worn-out shoes. His hands were small back then, too small for the tools. Sometimes the needles would pierce his fingers. Sometimes the skin would split and bleed from the rough leather. But he kept working, not because he loved it, because he had to. And yet, even in those difficult days, he remembered something interesting. His father used to whistle while he worked, not because life was easy, because he had learned something important. Complaining didn't change reality. Choosing your attitude did. She had dark brown hair that curled slightly near her shoulders and bright green eyes that seemed to glow whenever she laughed. The first time he heard her voice, he later said it sounded like music playing softly in the background of a quiet room. He fell in love almost immediately. They married 2 years later. For 9 years, life finally felt peaceful. They built a small home together. They had 2 children, a son named Marco and a daughter named Isabella. For the first time since childhood, Daniel felt something close to stability. He believed the hardest chapters of life were behind him. But life doesn't always move the way we expect. One afternoon in June of 1952, Elena walked upstairs to the rooftop of their apartment building to hang freshly washed clothes under the sun. It was something she had done hundreds of times before. But that day, something terrible happened. Without warning, she collapsed from a sudden brain aneurysm. She never even had time to call for help. She was gone before anyone could reach her. She was only 29 years old. Daniel was 32. And suddenly he found himself standing in the middle of a life he no longer recognized, holding 2 small children who no longer had a mother. Everything felt empty. Every room in the house carried her memory. The kitchen where she used to cook, the chair where she used to sit. The sound of her laughter that would never fill those spaces again. For months, Daniel became a different man. He was angry at everything. Angry at God, angry at the world, angry at the unfairness of life. He yelled at customers in his shop. He stopped eating properly. Some nights he didn't sleep at all. His grief turned into bitterness. And slowly, that bitterness began to affect the people around him. Until one night, something happened that changed everything. His daughter Isabella was 5 years old at the time. She quietly walked into the living room where Daniel was sitting in silence. Her small eyes were filled with tears, and she asked him a question that pierced deeper than any pain he had felt before. "Papa, why are you always angry? Did I do something wrong?" Daniel later said that moment felt like someone had shaken him awake from a dark dream, because in that moment he realized something heartbreaking. His children had lost their mother, and now they felt like they were losing their father too. That night he sat alone for a long time, thinking about the man he had become, and he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He said to himself, "Daniel, you can choose to stay angry, or you can choose to be the father your children need, but you can't be both." So the next morning, he chose differently, not because the pain disappeared, not because the sadness vanished, but because he understood something powerful. Hard times don't have to make you hard. You get to choose what they make you. Think about that for a moment. Life will bring challenges to everyone. No one escapes pain completely. But the real question is not what happens to you. The real question is, who do you become because of it? Tell me honestly in the comments. Do you believe difficult experiences make people stronger, or do they break people? I'm curious to see what you think, because Daniel's story was only beginning, and the choices he made next would surprise almost everyone around him. For the next few years, Daniel focused on one thing more than anything else in the world: his children. Every morning he woke up before the sun came up. He would make breakfast, get Marco and Isabella ready for school, and then open his small shoe repair shop. During the day, he worked harder than ever, stitching leather, fixing soles, polishing old boots until they looked new again. At night, when the shop finally closed, he returned home to 2 children who were still trying to understand why their mother never came back. And that's when Daniel made another quiet decision. He decided his home would not become a house of sadness. Yes, they would miss Elena. Yes, they would remember her. But their home would still have laughter inside it. So he started doing small things. Sometimes he burned the pasta while trying to cook, and the kids would laugh. Sometimes he tried to sing old songs in Italian, even though he sang terribly. On weekends, he would take them to the park and pretend he was racing them, even though he was already tired from work. The sadness never fully disappeared, but slowly something else began to grow beside it, hope. Years later, Daniel said something interesting about that time in his life. He said sadness and joy can exist in the same room. Most people think they have to wait until the sadness disappears before they can feel happy again, but that's not true. Sometimes joy shows up quietly while pain is still sitting beside it. Let me ask you something here. Have you ever gone through a difficult time but still found small moments that made you smile? Maybe a friend called you at the right moment. Maybe a stranger did something kind. Maybe a small memory made you laugh unexpectedly. If that has happened to you, type yes in the comments. It's amazing how many people discover light even in their darkest seasons. As the years passed, Daniel slowly rebuilt his life. By the time he reached his late 50s, his small shoe shop had become well known in the neighborhood. People trusted his work. Customers who once came with worn-out shoes now brought their children to him. For 26 years he worked in that same shop. 26 years of early mornings, long days, and quiet pride in the life he had built with his own hands. But life had another test waiting. One cold night in 1979, Daniel received a phone call that made his heart drop. There had been a fire. When he arrived at the street where his shop stood, bright flames were already rising through the roof. Firefighters were spraying water through broken windows while smoke filled the air. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, watching everything he had built slowly collapse into ashes. The wooden shelves he had installed himself, the tools his father once used, decades of work and memories, gone in one night. He was 59 years old, too old, some people said, to start over again. That night he felt something familiar returning. The same heavy feeling he experienced when Elena died. The same voice in his head whispering, "This is too much." For a moment he truly believed that chapter of his life was over. But then something unexpected happened. The next morning when Daniel walked through the neighborhood, people started stopping him on the street. Customers he had known for years. People whose shoes he had repaired dozens of times. One man shook his hand and said, "Don't worry, Daniel. When you open again, I'll be your first customer." Another woman said, "My husband and I have shoes waiting for you already." That's when Daniel realized something powerful. He hadn't only built a business, he had built relationships, and relationships are stronger than buildings. So a few weeks later, Daniel borrowed some money, rented a tiny space, and started again from the beginning. Same tools, same hands, same determination. It wasn't easy, but slowly the shop came back to life. And every time someone walked through the door, Daniel felt a little more grateful that he didn't give up. Let me ask you something here. Has life ever knocked you down when you thought everything was finally stable? Maybe a job loss, a business failure, or something unexpected that forced you to start over. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from zero, write the word rebuild in the comments. Because the truth is, some of the strongest people you'll ever meet are the ones who had to begin again. Years continued to pass. Marco and Isabella grew up. They built families of their own. Daniel became a grandfather, and for decades he lived quietly. He worked, he laughed with his children, and he accepted that maybe love had already played its role in his life. After Elena passed away, Daniel never dated anyone again, not because he couldn't, because he believed that chapter had already ended. But life has a strange way of surprising us when we least expect it. In 1991, Daniel was 71 years old. One Sunday afternoon, he went to a church gathering in Brooklyn. To be honest, he later joked that the only reason he went was because someone told him there would be homemade lasagna. He walked into the hall, grabbed a plate, and started looking for a place to sit. And that's when he noticed someone across the room. A woman sitting at a table with a group of people laughing loudly at something someone had said. Her name was Margaret Hill. She was 63 years old, a retired nurse, and she had the kind of smile that made her entire face glow. Daniel watched her laugh for a moment and thought something he hadn't thought in almost 40 years. That is the most beautiful sound I've heard in a long time. So he did something that surprised even himself. He walked across the room and introduced himself. Now here's the interesting part. Margaret was African American, and this was early 1990s Brooklyn. An elderly Italian man walking over to talk to a black woman didn't go unnoticed. People in the room actually stopped eating to watch the conversation. Some were curious, some were shocked, some were whispering, but Daniel didn't care, because for the first time in decades, he felt something warm in his chest again. A few months later, they started spending time together, walking through the park, drinking coffee, talking for hours about their lives, but not everyone approved. Daniel's own son, Marco, struggled to accept it. He believed his father was disrespecting Elena's memory. For nearly 2 years, father and son barely spoke, and that was one of the hardest choices Daniel had to face. But one day he sat Marco down and said something simple. "Son, I loved your mother with all my heart. That will never change. But I spent 40 years alone. Now I've met someone who makes me laugh again." Then he looked directly at him and said softly, "If the neighbors don't like it, the neighbors can mind their own business." And that leads to another lesson Daniel learned very late in life. At some point, you must stop living according to other people's opinions, because their opinions don't control your happiness, only your choices do. I want to ask you something honestly. How many decisions in your life have been influenced by what other people might think? A job you didn't take, a dream you didn't follow, a relationship you were afraid to pursue. If you've ever held yourself back because of other people's opinions, type "my life" in the comments, because almost everyone struggles with this at some point. Daniel and Margaret eventually married, and what happened next surprised everyone. The two of them shared 32 beautiful years together. 32 years filled with laughter, travel, music, family dinners, and quiet mornings drinking coffee together. Years that Daniel never expected to have, and years that proved something important. Life doesn't stop offering joy just because you're older. Sometimes it waits until you're wise enough to recognize it, but even those beautiful years eventually reach their final chapter. Last winter, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at 95 years old. Daniel held her hand through the night. He said goodbye quietly, and once again life placed him in front of a familiar crossroads: grief or gratitude, loss or appreciation for the years they shared. And just like every other difficult moment in his long life, Daniel made another choice.